I think at least in history, being Asian has this connotation of being associated with like the model minority. And if you look at like articles about the model minority in like Time magazine or whatnot, you see predominantly just Asian, like Chinese or Japanese students. Like they're the face of Asian Americans. However, like there's more than just two. Like it ranges from like so many people, so many shades of skin color. And I think skin color is very important to me, especially with what's going on in the world right now, dealing with race and police brutality and racial profiling. I feel like, at least for a lot of Filipinos, like I think stereotypically like we seem to be like the darker Asian. And I remember like I had to write like 6-word memoirs or something, but I wrote like Asian living in a brown body.
So, how do you identify racially?
Racially, I identify as Filipino American.
And then how do you identify ethnically?
Ethnically, Filipina, right? Is that it? Yes? Yeah, both of my parents were born and raised in the Philippines. I think even though I guess was raised sort of Americanized, I think I didn't realize how much that like the Filipino-ness of like my parents, I guess transferred over. I think that there are kind of some qualms that I have, kind of like tensions that I feel with like fully identifying as like Filipina, just because I don't know that complete experience. I think that there's a difference between being Filipina and Filipino American, right? And those are, I think sometimes we, like the way that we ethnically identify or just identify in general, like racially, can be conflated and can sometimes get mixed up, I guess. And so, yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe changing my answer to I ethnically identify as Filipina American and also racially identify as Filipina American, just because I don't think that my experience in being in America can completely and fully relate to what it means to have the experience of like immigrating from the Philippines here. If that makes any sense. So yeah.
Gotcha.
How do you identify racially?
I identify as Filipino.
And how do you identify ethnically?
I think that's an interesting question to ask, especially for at least like from my background, because even though I consider myself ethnically Filipino, I come from Mindanao, so like almost kind of like a marginalized community in the Philippines. So even though I identify ethnically as Filipino, a lot of like the culture and a lot of the communities and stories that are told or labeled as like a Filipino narrative, that's not something I can like relate to because I'm from like Mindanao.
Could you kind of expand the difference between, I guess, identifying as a person from Mindanao compared to just a regular person from, I guess, the Philippines, like in Manila?
Okay. I think like when I first came to the United States, and that became kind of like an identity that was like salient for me, being Filipino or being Filipino American. It wasn't until I came to Berkeley and started kind of like learning more about why or what the Filipino identity is, or at least like how it has been shaped by Spanish colonization, American colonization, and how important the Filipino identity was in like nation building and in these processes of colonization. So for me to kind of say I'm Filipino puts me into kind of like the umbrella term of what Filipino means, even though necessarily that's not something that like I can connect to in terms of like my upbringing, my background. So for example, I think one of the most important examples for me is that like Filipinos, the national language is largely based on Tagalog, even though I personally, when I grew up, I didn't speak Tagalog because I speak primarily Bisaya. So for me, like that's like one example in the ways in which the Filipino identity doesn't really accurately reflect like my upbringing and my background.
So how do you identify racially?
I identify racially as, I mean, according to the census, I'm 2 or more races. I'm mixed, so I'm half Filipino, and then my dad's side of the family is Polish and Russian, but culturally Jewish, so I'm half Jewish. So, yeah.
So how would you identify ethnically then?
Ethnically. Ethnically. Ooh, it's a tough question. I don't know if I identify with one or the other more. I would say that in terms of like what I've experienced with my family and in terms of closeness, I feel pretty equally close to both my Filipino side and my Jewish side. But at the same time, I feel like I also feel like the cultural values in both like the Jewish community and the Filipino community are very similar in the fact that like they both strongly value family and they value community and connection and I feel like because of that I would say like ethnically I identify with both. But I think that society only sees that I'm brown and can't really see that like Jewish side of myself. I mean, other than my hair, because it's not like there's not really Filipinos with my hair, which in itself has had its own challenges. But I would say that, so according to society, I think I almost feel more forced to identify with my Filipino identity because I think it gives me a stronger sense of like what it means to be a woman of color than my Jewish side. Because yeah, I think my Jewish side has also a lot of integral pieces and like has played a significant part of my identity, but I would say my Filipino side has like actually forced me to reckon with like I'm a woman of color and the system oppresses me in its own way.
So do you ever identify as Asian American then?
I do, but I prefer Pacific Islander. Just because like although I participate in the like Asian American spaces, like I prefer AAPI and like Southeast Asian and like actually having like our identity as Filipinos like recognized in that category. Yeah, so I don't really call myself Asian American. I feel like that's more so something that someone tells me I am.
Do you ever identify as Asian American?
I do. I think in different spaces. I think it just depends on like where you are. I think like for people who don't really know a lot about the Filipino community or being Filipino, or even like, yeah, can even point out like, I guess like what it means to be a Filipino. I think people would ask like, oh, are you Asian or something like that, and then I think the default would be yes, right? So I think Asian American as an identity, as kind of like an umbrella identity, and being Filipino as something that is more specific to me and my experience.
So you're talking about in certain spaces that you identify as Asian American. So when you do identify as Asian American, what are the reasons why you would identify as Asian American?
Versus Filipino?
Yeah.
I think I would still identify as Filipino and Asian American, but kind of like as people recognizing, I think, Asian American as an umbrella type of category. Even though I have my personal qualms about, I think, lumping a bunch of different Asian American identities together without kind of like specifying, because there are different experiences. Even within like the Filipino community, there are different experiences, right? And so I think that like in certain spaces, the reason why I would talk about being Asian American and like I would also insert being Filipino, talking about being Asian American as something that people, I guess, know or have like access to knowing in some way, shape, or form. But I think that if they ask that, I would also ask for like a follow-up question of like specifically, I guess, how do you identify? Yeah, I don't really know.
Now, do you ever identify as Asian American?
I don't identify as Asian American because primarily I identify as Filipino.
Have you ever like, I guess, identified with Asian American in any sense, whether it was you were in an Asian American type of like, I guess, workshop or something, where you had to like, or you decided to identify as that, or?
I mean, I think definitely. I think when I first immigrated to the United States, that was like an identity that was put on me as an Asian American, and tying to that all these different like narratives and stereotypes of what an Asian American is. It really wasn't until coming into Cal and being part of PAS and the Filipino community that I really take or like gain agency in claiming my identity as Filipino, and starting to kind of like see how that better relates or better informs my experiences, rather than kind of just like opting into this like what identities that are placed on me. So being like Asian American.
Racially, I would identify as Asian, Asian American, ethnically Filipino American, Filipino.
Now, between these two identities that you spoke of, which do you identify more strongly with, and why?
Thought this was a really good question. For me, I think again it depends on the context. Interestingly enough, I feel like within the pill community, sometimes I'm not seen as necessarily Filipino just because of the way I look, like my skin color, my eyes, whatever, stuff like that, like phenotypical features. So sometimes I feel that like a weird place in that. Usually if I'm just walking around like outside type thing, people ask about, they know that I'm Asian, but they don't know what type of Asian, so that's really interesting. But to answer the question, which one do I feel like is more important to me, right?
You identify more strongly with.
Identify more strongly with. I would say during high school, I'd probably say Asian. During my racial identity as an Asian. During college, I would probably say my Filipino ethnicity. Where I grew up, there's a lot more Filipinos than when I went to college. It's like, oh, where are they? So depends on the context.
I identify now more with the Filipino American identity because I've deliberately tried to learn more about that culture. Growing up, I guess I did identify more with the Asian American culture because I grew up in Chinatown in LA, where I didn't know any other Filipinos at all. Everyone around me was of like so many other like different Asian races, and so I was exposed to like all types of, or so many different people from like different, their parents grew up in different countries, so that even though like because I think it's because I didn't know any other Filipinos, I felt more inclined to identify as Asian American because all of them were around me. I kind of just wanted to feel like I belonged or something.
Got it. Why?
I definitely identify strongest with being Filipino and Filipino American, because I think especially with like the term Asian American, there's a lot of model minority plays such a significant role in folks' conception of what Asian American is, and I'm very happy that I'm in that part of my, I guess, like process of like thinking about what I identify as, to start kind of like really realizing and taking ownership of the fact that like it's okay for me to not identify as Asian American, that I can identify as Filipino, because that the narratives that are attributed to like what being Filipino means better reflects like my background.
So, what makes the Filipinx experience at Cal different from the Asian American experience?
I
think it really comes down to the fact that the Philippines was colonized by the United States. I feel like that is what, like, I feel like that's what makes it different, is that we actually have a direct tie to the United States, whereas like other Asian countries are different. And it's not just our direct ties with the United States, but like, I guess our other colonial histories of being colonized by the Spanish, for example, having the Japanese occupy the Philippines for quite some time.
I think that like that's the issue really, is that I don't think necessarily the question is that they're different from each other, but within the Asian American community, there's so many different narratives and there's so many different communities, that what happens when we kind of have that kind of, or when we use that kind of rhetoric, we create this kind of like monolithic image of what an Asian American is. But when we desegregate that and we kind of like really critically look at what the communities are within Asian American, we really see the different ways in which different communities are performing or accessing higher education.
So what happens when you disaggregate the data from the Asian American experience and breaking it into the different Asian ethnic groups, looking specifically at Filipinos?
So yeah, I don't know the exact percentage of Filipinos that are actually here on campus, but I know PASS has that sweatshirt or something that says either 2.3% or 2.7%, but that's like approximately 800 students, undergraduate students here on campus. And when I think about that, like that's a really low number, considering the fact that like when I hear about people talking about how many API students are here on campus, that's like about 40%. So comparing like 2 point something percent to 40%, that's a really stark number.